The man hailed as the sole heir to the greatest basketball throne ever built was systematically destroyed from the inside out. Anfernee Hardaway had the entire sports world at his fingertips in the 1990s, orchestrating a massive corporate empire before a sudden, devastating physical collapse completely erased his athletic prime. But the darkest secrets of this staggering rise and fall do not begin in wealthy professional locker rooms. They start on the unforgiving streets of Memphis. According to highly detailed sports biographical profiles from that exact era, Anfernee was born in July 1971 into a harsh reality where escaping poverty was statistically microscopic. His mother worked miles away, leaving him to be raised by his stern grandmother, Louise. Here is where the first piece of our investigative puzzle demands closer inspection. How does a poor kid named Anfernee transform into a highly lucrative global brand known simply as Penny? In numerous recorded interviews, Louise explained she affectionately called him Pretty, but her thick southern drawl made the neighborhood kids hear Penny. A heartwarming origin story, absolutely. But does a massive, ruthless footwear empire truly build its entire marketing foundation on a simple neighborhood mispronunciation? Or was this a meticulously calculated narrative neatly packaged for the media? The whispers around the city courts quickly became deafening roars. In the heavily archived pages of local sports newspapers, reporters noted a teenager moving with the fluid, surgical grace of a point guard, while possessing the towering frame of a power forward. Scouts fiercely flooded his high school gymnasiums, their confidential clipboards heavily filled with glowing evaluations of a strictly generational talent. Everyone was absolutely certain they were witnessing the birth of an unstoppable living legend. However, this perfectly crafted sports fairy tale was violently derailed long before the massive corporate contracts were ever signed. In April 1991, a sudden gunshot rang out on a dark Memphis street, leaving a permanent, chilling mark on his medical records and nearly stopping a billion-dollar legacy before it even took a single breath. The terrifying crack of a firearm changes a life in a fraction of a second. And for Anfernee Hardaway, that sound almost erased his future before it even began. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening, but an armed robbery quickly spiraled out of control. According to police reports filed in April 1991, the young basketball prodigy found himself staring down the barrel of a gun, culminating in a stray bullet, ricocheting directly into his right foot. The immediate medical prognosis was grim. In the official case files, it appeared that the bone was severely fractured, casting a massive, terrifying shadow over his ability to ever run or jump with the same explosive power again. This brings up a deeply uncomfortable question. How did a prospect with a shattered foot still manage to keep his draft stock so incredibly high? Did the people managing his career suppress the true severity of the medical charts, or was his sheer willpower just that blinding? While local Memphis press publications heavily documented his hospitalization, the national narrative was carefully managed to focus on his miraculous resilience rather than the potential permanent damage. The dark side of fame dictates that a damaged product does not sell, so Anfernee was forced to push his body to the absolute limit during his intense rehabilitation. The psychological toll of almost losing his dream transformed him. The fear of failure pushed him into a manic, obsessive focus on the game, turning a naturally gifted athlete into a relentless machine driven by basic survival instincts. He spent grueling hours in the dark gym, forcing his recovering foot to bear the enormous weight of his towering ambitions. The physical wound eventually closed, but the mental scars remained, fundamentally altering how he approached every single game. Having miraculously escaped a devastating physical catastrophe, Anfernee Hardaway was convinced the worst was firmly behind him. Yet, he was entirely unprepared for another massive obstacle. And in the autumn of that exact same year, a newly filed document in the university admissions office threatened to strip away his scholarship entirely. The invisible barriers off the court often prove much harder to break through than any defensive scheme drawn up by a rival coach. For Anfernee Hardaway, the next devastating blow did not come from a physical injury, but from an academic ruling that publicly humiliated him on a national scale. Due to a highly controversial regulation known as Proposition 48, his initial academic test scores were deemed insufficient, forcing him to sit out his entire freshman season. The public backlash was swift and absolutely merciless. Sports columnists were quick to attach the incredibly damaging label of a foolish, uneducated athlete to his rapidly growing name. In the relentless world of college sports, such a brutal reputation can permanently derail a career, severely limiting a player's marketability and future leadership potential. But how much of this narrative was actually true, and how much was just the media ruthlessly feeding on a vulnerable young man? Anfernee absolutely refused to be a victim of the press. He channeled his massive frustration into his textbooks with the exact same ferocious intensity he displayed on the hardwood. His academic turnaround was nothing short of astonishing. According to the official academic rosters of Memphis State University, he completely shattered the negative stereotypes by earning a highly coveted spot on the prestigious Dean's List. In the pages of regional newspapers, reporters noted that this dramatic shift in his grades proved his exceptional intelligence and unyielding work ethic. When he finally stepped back onto the court, the College League statistical breakdowns for the 1992 to 1993 season showcased a furious player operating with pure vengeance. He completely dominated his opponents, effortlessly registering triple-doubles and proving beyond any reasonable doubt that his mind was just as devastatingly sharp as his signature crossover dribble. He had completely rewritten his own story, permanently silencing the harsh critics who dared to question his dedication. By June 1993, his phenomenal performances made him the absolute most coveted prize for the entire professional league. But behind the closed doors of one specific franchise office, a highly secret deal was being orchestrated that would absolutely shock millions of fans on live television. The sheer audacity of the Orlando management on the night of the 1993 professional basketball draft remains one of the most heavily debated gambles in the history of the sport. Imagine holding the absolute most valuable asset in the entire league, the #1 overall draft pick, and a guaranteed superstar forward in Chris Webber, only to trade him away to the highest bidder. The arena erupted in a chorus of deafening boos when the commissioner announced the shocking transaction. But what exactly possessed the franchise to make such an incredibly risky move when they already had the colossal Shaquille O'Neal dominating the paint? According to the official transcripts of the post-draft press conference held on June 30, 1993, the management confidently claimed this was a meticulously calculated strategy. However, behind closed doors, a completely different narrative was heavily circulating. Whispers within the industry suggested that Anfernee Hardaway had practically begged the Orlando executives for a highly secretive, last-minute private workout. He allegedly flew in specifically to play a brutal one-on-one session against active roster players, completely dismantling them in the process. The sheer dominance he displayed was so overwhelming that the front office immediately pivoted. Looking closely at the legally binding contracts finalized that summer, the franchise received not only Hardaway, but also 3 future first-round draft picks, a massive haul that formally documented the staggering value of the exchange. Yet, the enraged fans sitting in the stands felt utterly betrayed, demanding answers for why their team passed on a guaranteed foundational piece. The relentless criticism poured in from every major sports publication, painting the front office as hopelessly incompetent. However, the deafening anger radiating from the grandstands vanished almost instantly, heavily suppressed by the sheer magnitude of the profits that were about to flow in. In the autumn of 1993, journalists suddenly gained access to confidential financial documents, revealing the astronomical sums that corporate sponsors were suddenly eager to inject into this highly controversial new duo. The immediate collision of Shaquille O'Neal and Anfernee Hardaway on the professional hardwood created a shockwave that fundamentally altered the landscape of the entire 1990s. Critics who had ruthlessly mocked the draft day trade were forced to swallow their words as this newly minted pair began systematically destroying the competition with an electrifying blend of raw power and mesmerizing finesse. The towering center and the extraordinarily gifted point guard instantly drew heavy comparisons to the legendary pairing of Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But was this immediate chemistry genuinely authentic, or was it a carefully manufactured illusion meant to sell tickets? The truth was undeniable once the games commenced. Hardaway seamlessly adapted to the blinding lights of the professional stage, delivering incredibly precise passes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Looking at the official voting tallies released by the league office for the Rookie of the Year award in the 1993 to 1994 season, Anfernee secured a massively impressive runner-up finish, completely validating the controversial gamble taken by the management. He was a revelation, playing with a level of maturity that utterly terrified opposing coaches. In numerous glowing interviews published in prominent sports magazines of that era, Shaquille O'Neal enthusiastically praised his new teammate, publicly declaring that Hardaway was the exact missing piece they desperately needed to conquer the championship mountain. The Orlando franchise rapidly morphed into the undisputed main attraction of the league, drawing massive television ratings and completely selling out arenas across the country. They were the ultimate showmen, a flawless basketball machine that seemed entirely unstoppable. Yet this magnificent honeymoon phase was destined to be tragically short-lived. Even as the two superstars smiled brightly for the flashing cameras and celebrated their stunning victories on the court, an invisible wedge was slowly being driven between them. While the team reveled in their newfound dominance, deep inside the heavily guarded corporate offices of a major footwear brand, a lucrative multi-million-dollar promotional campaign was already approved, laying down the foundation for a devastating rivalry that would slowly poison their seemingly unbreakable bond. The dark side of fame rarely announces its arrival with a loud crash. Instead, it slowly creeps in through the glowing allure of massive endorsements and relentless public adoration. For Anfernee Hardaway, his rapid transformation from a phenomenal athlete into a towering pop culture icon was propelled by a tiny, loud-mouthed plastic puppet. The masterminds at Nike crafted an ingenious alter ego named Lil Penny, brilliantly voiced by a famous comedian, designed to heavily contrast with Hardaway's naturally quiet and reserved demeanor. The marketing strategy was an absolute masterstroke. According to the detailed quarterly reports compiled by leading sports marketing agencies, the sales figures for the signature Air Max Penny footwear line completely shattered industry expectations, flying off the shelves at a historically unprecedented rate. Anfernee was no longer just a basketball player. He was a highly lucrative corporate empire. But the blinding spotlight creates massive shadows, and in the fiercely competitive environment of a professional locker room, soaring popularity often breeds deep-seated resentment. In the financial columns of major business publications throughout 1995, analysts noted that the sheer value of Hardaway's commercial contracts was beginning to heavily rival, and in some areas entirely eclipse, the financial clout of his colossal teammate. Shaquille O'Neal was naturally accustomed to being the undisputed center of the universe, the sole shining star of the franchise. How does a massive ego handle the uncomfortable reality that a plastic toy promoting a point guard sneakers is suddenly generating more cultural buzz than his own dominant performances? Whispers of intense jealousy began to circulate widely among league insiders. The spectacular dynamic duo was secretly fracturing under the immense weight of conflicting ambitions and corporate favoritism. Yet, the simmering tension in the locker room had to be immediately pushed aside, entirely overshadowed by a looming threat of unprecedented magnitude. All petty grievances were suddenly rendered completely irrelevant in the spring of 1995, when a legendary figure whose mere name struck absolute terror into the hearts of every player stepped back onto the court to reclaim his stolen throne. The entire basketball universe stood completely frozen in absolute disbelief during the Eastern Conference semifinals. For months, the reigning king of the sport had been away swinging a baseball bat, but his sudden return cast a massive, intimidating shadow over the league. Anfernee Hardaway was no longer just a highly talented prospect. He was forced to step directly into the blinding spotlight against the ultimate measuring stick, Michael Jordan. The tension inside the arena was thick enough to cut with a knife. Was this young Orlando roster genuinely ready to overthrow the established dynasty, or were they merely lambs marching blindly toward the slaughter? The definitive answer arrived in a spectacular, defining sequence that completely shifted the balance of power. According to the official box score of the first game of the series in May 1995, the Orlando defense executed a flawless trap in the final agonizing seconds of the match. Hardaway and his teammate, Nick Anderson, converged on the legend, cleanly stripping the ball away and sealing a monumental, historic victory. In the detailed post-game reports published by major sports media outlets, journalists heavily highlighted this incredibly rare moment of vulnerability from the returning champion. But was this legendary steal a mere fluke of timing, or the ultimate, undeniable passing of the torch? In the official transcripts of the post-game press conferences, Michael Jordan himself admitted that Hardaway possessed an incredibly rare, undeniable talent, essentially crowning him as a genuinely worthy adversary. The psychological pressure placed upon a young point guard to eliminate the greatest player in history is almost incomprehensible. Yet Hardaway absorbed every single ounce of that immense pressure and weaponized it. He orchestrated the offense with absolute surgical precision, proving to the entire world that he could dictate the brutal pace against the absolute best defensive minds in the sport. They had conquered the ultimate beast, entirely slaying the dragon that had terrified the Eastern Conference for an entire decade. The path to the ultimate championship glory seemed completely wide open and paved with gold. However, the sheer euphoria of that triumphant series was a highly dangerous illusion, masking a fatal hidden flaw in the team's mental fortitude. The grand celebration was violently cut short because waiting for them in June 1995 was a brutal collision in the championship finals that would permanently shatter the psychological foundation of this incredibly promising young franchise. The highest peak of professional sports is an incredibly unforgiving environment where a single missed opportunity can easily spark a devastating mental collapse. The Orlando franchise entered the championship round, riding a massive wave of absolute invincibility, fully expecting to easily dismantle the Houston Rockets. Instead, they walked directly into a terrifying buzzsaw of veteran execution and relentless pressure. The highly anticipated coronation of Anfernee Hardaway and his colossal teammate rapidly turned into a deeply humiliating public execution. Looking closely at the official archives of the league detailing the statistics of the June 1995 final series, the numbers reveal a total systemic breakdown. A brutal 4-0 sweep was permanently etched into the history books. How does a team that just eliminated the greatest player on earth completely disintegrate on the game's biggest stage? In the heavily scrutinized game logs of that catastrophic week, it was widely noted that the devastating sequence of missed free throws in the opening match acted as a deadly psychological poison. The confidence of the entire roster simply vanished into thin air. In the immediate aftermath, sports analysts flooded the summer newspapers with scathing columns, harshly criticizing the defensive schemes of Orlando and openly questioning the mental toughness of their young superstars. The media desperately needed a scapegoat, and the whispers in the locker room quickly turned incredibly toxic. Who was truly to blame for this monumental failure? Was the towering center too distracted by his rapidly growing media empire, or was Hardaway fundamentally incapable of carrying the heavy offensive load when the defensive traps tightened? The intense public scrutiny forced Anfernee to deeply internalize the bitter sting of this monumental failure. He absorbed the agonizing criticism, using the crushing weight of the defeat to fuel a grueling summer of relentless training. He was absolutely determined to return stronger, faster, and utterly flawless. The tragic irony is that nobody realized this painful finals appearance was not the beginning of a glorious multi-year dynasty, but rather the absolute peak of their collective ascent. The invisible clock was already ticking down to zero because in October 1995, the team medical staff issued a devastating verdict that forced Anfernee to carry the entire weight of the franchise on his own fragile shoulders. True greatness is frequently forged in the absolute darkest moments of despair, but the sheer physical toll exacted by carrying an entire team alone is a massive debt that the human body eventually collects. The highly anticipated 1995 to 1996 season began with a catastrophic blow. The colossal center of the franchise suffered a severe thumb injury, completely removing him from the active roster for an extended period. The entire burden of an incredibly ambitious organization suddenly fell squarely onto the shoulders of Anfernee Hardaway. He was no longer just the brilliant facilitator. He had to become the undisputed, absolute apex predator of the league. And he successfully delivered a campaign of pure, unadulterated brilliance. Reviewing the official voting ballots for the Most Valuable Player award of that grueling season, Hardaway secured a prominent, highly respected position among the absolute elite players on the planet. He was a mesmerizing force of nature, single-handedly willing his team to victory night after agonizing night. But this spectacular individual success masked a terrifying, deeply hidden reality. According to the detailed performance reports published by the league, the sheer volume of minutes Hardaway spent running on the hardwood without a single substitution was historically alarming. Was the coaching staff intentionally sacrificing his long-term health to secure immediate, short-term victories? Or was his own fierce competitive drive entirely blinding him to the immense physical danger? In the restricted medical logs from that grueling winter, journalists later uncovered notes detailing the very first ominous complaints of persistent, throbbing pain in his legs. The relentless pounding on the hardwood was slowly, invisibly deteriorating his vulnerable joints. The dark side of his soaring fame demanded constant, grueling physical exertion, forcing him to play through agonizing soreness while heavily masking the deep discomfort from the flashing cameras and the demanding corporate sponsors. He successfully navigated that treacherous season, completely validating his status as a transcendent generational superstar capable of holding an entire city together. Yet the physical foundation he fought so desperately to protect was already severely crumbling beneath his tired feet. He had given his body and soul to the franchise, entirely unaware that in the scorching summer of 1996, a sudden phone call echoing through the general manager's office would completely obliterate the Orlando Empire forever. The perfect basketball empire did not collapse from accurate shots by opponents on the court, but within the suffocating hidden offices of sports agents. The summer of 1996 brought an epical event that permanently altered the balance of power across the entire league and fundamentally fractured the career of our hero. The behind-the-scenes games surrounding free agency are always full of dirty secrets, and the Orlando management decided to play an incredibly dangerous financial roulette with their dominant center. According to massive newspaper fan polls conducted that summer, the front office was desperately trying to test the waters, artificially pitting the two superstars against each other to see who the public believed deserved the absolute maximum payout. And this is where the most uncomfortable question arises. Did the franchise simply try to save colossal amounts of money, or did Anfernee Hardaway personally insist, through his representatives, that his status and his future salary must remain the absolute highest on the payroll? In the reports of major sports media from that specific period, numerous anonymous leaks surfaced claiming that the brilliant point guard categorically refused to surrender his financial leadership. This heavily concealed struggle for absolute influence in the locker room led to a historical catastrophe. In July 1996, the thunder struck. The details of the Giants' new contract with the Los Angeles franchise were officially published, revealing a staggering astronomical sum of $121 million. But why did this massive figure surface exactly when Florida seemed like the undisputed contender for championship rings for years to come? The answer lies in deeply bruised egos, the aggressive schemes of greedy agents, and the management's categorical reluctance to pay two generational talents simultaneously. The monumental betrayal was complete, and the great duo was permanently dissolved. Left in complete, deafening isolation, Penny instantly transformed from a universal darling into the primary target for a ruthless press. The devastated city demanded immediate answers, and an invisible, massive target appeared on Hardaway's back, attracting absolutely all the incoming criticism. He finally acquired that unlimited power within the franchise that, according to persistent rumors, he had secretly desired for so long. However, this boundless authority proved to be thoroughly toxic. Attempting to bring the entire roster under his sole control resulted in an unprecedented secret player conspiracy brewing behind closed doors in the early months of 1997, a mutiny that would soon destroy the career of the man steering their recent victories. Having acquired the keys to the entire franchise, Anfernee Hardaway faced an incredible amount of public pressure that rapidly began tearing the team apart from the inside. The 1996 to 1997 campaign morphed into a genuine psychological war between the primary star and head coach Brian Hill. The atmosphere inside the locker room became so incredibly toxic that the tension could literally be cut with a knife. Instead of uniting in the face of mounting difficulties, the players began violently fracturing into hostile, isolated factions. In the harsh columns of sports, insiders from that exact period, it was explicitly stated that Hardaway was openly sabotaging the tactical instructions of the coaching staff and methodically turning his teammates against their mentor. But who was actually orchestrating this hidden chaos, and why did the front office turn a blind eye to the blatant sabotage on the hardwood for so long? In public investigative materials, independent journalists thoroughly described how localized dissatisfaction escalated into a full-scale mutiny, with Penny repeatedly named as the primary instigator. In February 1997, the official press release announcing the firing of Brian Hill was distributed to the media. And precisely at this highly resonant moment, a fact emerges that completely shifts the perception of the entire situation. The devastating decision to terminate the coach was reportedly finalized only after a highly scandalous, closed-door voting session among the basketball players themselves. As widely reported in the local press, it was Anfernee's decisive vote that served as the final execution order for the specialist who had guided them to the finals just a couple of years prior. From the smiling darling of the public and the golden boy of the league, Hardaway was instantly transformed by the media into a capricious, deeply selfish, and incredibly spoiled star carrying the permanent dark label of a coach killer. This grim reputation weighed heavily upon him, rapidly alienating his most loyal fans. He achieved his ultimate goal, coldly eliminating an unwanted manager and installing more compliant personnel. But the true cost of this backstage victory was truly exorbitant. Penny secured his desired absolute comfort and boundless control over the playbook. But it was precisely during the grueling playoff series in the spring of 1997 that his own body unexpectedly handed him a severe bill, one that he found himself physically incapable of paying. The truest drama in professional sports always unfolds where unyielding ambition violently collides with the devastating fragility of human anatomy. Left entirely without his colossal superstar partner and having successfully overhauled the coaching staff, Anfernee Hardaway was absolutely obligated to prove his undeniable individual greatness to the entire world during the most critical elimination games. The brutal series against the Miami Heat in the spring of 1997 became the absolute apex of his heroic individual brilliance and, simultaneously, the precise starting point of his prolonged, agonizing physical collapse. Orlando was hopelessly trailing in the matchup, forcing Penny to activate an almost mythical level of performance on the court. According to the official game logs from that April, he delivered 2 consecutive, purely spectacular performances, dropping over 40 points in each contest and practically dismantling the elite defense of their bitter rival all by himself. It was a moment of deafening success on the hardwood, instantly silencing absolutely all the vicious skeptics. But what horrifying price had to be paid for this deeply historical exhibition? Right in the middle of an incredibly sharp, explosive drive toward the rim, a fatal snap echoed deep inside his left knee, permanently altering the trajectory of his soaring career. The pain was piercing, sharp, and entirely paralyzing, but the unforgiving culture of professional basketball in the 1990s offered absolutely zero tolerance for physical weakness. In numerous late interviews with respected sports doctors of that era, the dark side of fame was thoroughly detailed, specifically highlighting the terrifying practice of total medical numbing, where top-tier stars were cynically forced to compete after receiving massive doses of hidden painkillers. According to anonymous sources closely tied to the medical staff, Hardaway categorically refused to take a break, stubbornly ignoring the screaming alarm bells of his own deteriorating body to fiercely protect his reputation as an ultimate winner. And here lies the most agonizing mystery of those years. Was this a purely voluntary sacrifice by a legendary athlete, or did a ruthless corporate system coldly squeeze the very last drops of greatness out of him, perfectly aware of the critical cartilage damage? He noticeably limped, gritting his teeth in pure agony, yet he stubbornly continued pushing the ball forward, carefully hiding his mounting internal torment from millions of viewers. The franchise management, heavily blinded by the desperate thirst for immediate television ratings and lucrative playoff revenues, strictly insisted on his constant presence on the floor. This blind, reckless chase for commercial triumphs culminated in a terrifying surgical entry appearing in his confidential medical files in the winter of 1997, sending the legend under the knife and triggering an irreversible chain reaction of total physical destruction. The devastating physical toll of carrying an entire franchise finally culminated in a grim medical reality that Anfernee Hardaway could no longer mask with sheer willpower. The 1997 to 1998 season opened not with dazzling crossover dribbles, but with the chilling, sterile lights of a surgical operating room. According to the official medical bulletins released by the Orlando franchise in the late months of 1997, Penny underwent his first major reconstructive knee surgery, a deeply invasive procedure that was supposed to require extensive, carefully managed rehabilitation. But in the ruthless, profit-driven corporate machinery of professional basketball, patience is an incredibly rare commodity. The dark side of fame dictates that a highly paid asset must remain visible, and the pressure to return prematurely was absolutely suffocating. In the investigative press records documenting the conflicts of the early 1998 calendar year, journalists highlighted a massive behind-the-scenes dispute regarding Hardaway's participation in the upcoming mid-season All-Star exhibition game. Why would a franchise, fully aware of his freshly stitched ligaments, actively encourage or even quietly permit their central franchise player to risk his entire future in a completely meaningless exhibition showcase. The heavy whispers in the locker room suggested that the massive corporate sponsors and the league front office demanded his star power to artificially boost dropping television ratings. As he visibly limped back onto the court, far ahead of any logical medical schedule, the once unbreakable bond between the player and the management began to violently fracture. The executives in Orlando, perhaps fully realizing the permanent physical damage they had indirectly caused, cynically began leaking rumors heavily questioning his pain tolerance and his overall professional dedication. They openly doubted the superstar they had built their entire empire upon. This incredibly toxic environment of mutual distrust completely poisoned his final days in Florida. The magical illusion was permanently shattered, and the front office coldly decided it was time to extract whatever remaining financial value they could from his rapidly deteriorating physical condition. The ultimate betrayal was formalized in the sweltering heat of summer, when in August 1999, official trade documents were forcefully slapped onto the general manager's desk, permanently shipping Anfernee out of the city he had once proudly conquered. Escaping a highly toxic environment often feels like a miraculous salvation, but sometimes a completely fresh start is nothing more than a beautiful mirage, hiding an impending catastrophe. The arrival of Penny Hardaway in the scorching desert of Arizona was heavily marketed as the ultimate basketball renaissance. The Phoenix Suns orchestrated a massive blockbuster transaction, pairing Penny with the brilliant playmaker Jason Kidd to form an explosive offensive backcourt that the media immediately dubbed as the backcourt of the year 2000. Based on the legally binding sign and trade documents filed with the league office in August 1999, this monumental gamble was valued at a staggering $86 million spread over 7 years. That astronomical figure immediately raises a deeply uncomfortable, critical question. Did the Phoenix medical staff genuinely believe his heavily damaged knee could miraculously withstand the brutal, relentless grind of a massive long-term contract? Or were they simply blinded by the sheer corporate marketing potential of two legendary names sharing the exact same jersey? Initially, the expensive gamble appeared to pay off spectacularly. Looking closely at the official statistical ledgers from the first month of their inaugural season together, the pairing produced electrifying moments of absolute offensive brilliance, giving the desperately hopeful fans a tantalizing glimpse of a seemingly resurrected superstar. However, the harsh reality of the hardwood slowly began to expose a deeply agonizing truth. Anfernee was no longer the explosively fast, gravity-defying primary initiator he used to be. Adapting to playing without the ball in his hands constantly forced him into an unfamiliar secondary role, severely breaking down the psychological confidence of a man who was once universally considered the sole heir to the greatest throne in the sport. He was fighting a desperate, invisible battle against his own deteriorating physical limitations. Just when the local fans truly believed he had finally found peace and a sustainable rhythm in the desert, his heavily scarred body issued a terrifying final warning. The fragile illusion of a grand revival was permanently shattered during a seemingly routine physical collision on the court in the spring of the year 2000, when a highly specialized doctor delivered a horrifying medical diagnosis that echoed through the league like a devastating final verdict for his athletic prime. There are certain highly specific medical terms in the unforgiving world of professional sports that instantly strike pure, unadulterated terror into the hearts of absolute elite athletes, and microfracture surgery was undoubtedly the most devastating verdict of them all. The complex procedure was incredibly invasive, essentially drilling microscopic holes directly into the damaged bone to artificially stimulate the precarious growth of heavily compromised cartilage. According to the highly detailed public clinical reports outlining the surgical intervention performed on Anfernee Hardaway in the year 2000, The primary medical objective was no longer to restore his legendary, gravity-defying explosiveness, but simply to salvage his basic ability to walk without experiencing excruciating, paralyzing pain. This grim medical reality fundamentally shifted the entire trajectory of his life. How does a global cultural icon, a man whose entire multi-million-dollar brand was built entirely upon his breathtaking aerial acrobatics, psychologically survive the terrifying realization that his elite athleticism is permanently erased? The agonizing months of grueling rehabilitation that closely followed stripped away the shimmering, protective illusion of his invincibility. In the official attendance records and playing time logs for the 2000 to 2001 season, it was starkly documented that Penny managed to heavily struggle through a mere 4 agonizing games before his damaged body completely shut down once again. This remarkably low number was not just a tragic statistical anomaly, it was undeniable documentary evidence of a rapidly collapsing physical empire. The phenomenal superstar capable of entirely taking over a playoff game had completely vanished, abruptly replaced by a severely hobbled veteran desperately clinging to the fading ghost of his former glorious years. The Phoenix organization suddenly realized they were legally locked into paying tens of millions of dollars to a fragile physical shell of the legendary player they thought they had originally acquired. The staggering financial weight of his massive contract rapidly transformed him from a revered savior into a heavily burdensome liability for the entire franchise. The incredibly warm welcome he had received in the desert quickly evaporated, fully replaced by cold, calculated corporate panic. The front office desperately needed to entirely eliminate this colossal financial anchor from their accounting ledgers, leading directly to a highly toxic, deeply cynical maneuver in January 2004, when his heavily bloated contract became the primary bargaining chip in one of the absolute most disastrous trades of the entire decade. The glittering lights of Madison Square Garden have historically served as the ultimate stage for basketball royalty, but for a fading superstar burdened by an enormously inflated contract, those same lights can quickly transform into a brutal, unforgiving interrogation room. In January 2004, the league office formally registered one of the most heavily scrutinized financial transactions of the entire decade. According to the official financial ledgers from that exact month, Anfernee Hardaway was shipped to the New York Knicks as part of a blockbuster package deal centered around Stephon Marbury. On paper, it was heavily promoted as a triumphant return to a premier television market, but the underlying reality was profoundly toxic. The New York press is notoriously ruthless, and reporters immediately zeroed in on the staggering discrepancy between his astronomical salary and his sharply declining physical output. Reading through the scathing investigative columns published in the New York Post throughout that season, journalists mercilessly calculated exactly how many thousands of dollars the franchise was paying him for every single minute he spent merely sitting on the sideline. Was this relentless media assault entirely justified, or was Hardaway simply the incredibly unlucky scapegoat for a chaotic, thoroughly dysfunctional front office? The locker room environment he walked into was an absolute disaster, heavily plagued by oversized egos, constant internal infighting, and a relentless revolving door of head coaches like Larry Brown and Isaiah Thomas. The documentary evidence of this unstable era paints a terrifying picture of a once great leader completely isolated within his own team. He was earning superstar money, but he was treated like a completely expendable afterthought by the management. The intense psychological pressure of being relentlessly booed by your own hometown fans while fully knowing your damaged body can no longer silence them is absolutely crushing. He sat quietly on the end of the bench, helplessly watching his legendary legacy being systematically dismantled by a city that demands absolute perfection. He was still collecting millions, but in the ensuing 2005 to 2006 season, the league front office would officially record a deeply humiliating tactical decision that completely trampled whatever remaining pride the legend had left. The absolute hardest pill for any former professional conqueror to swallow is the terrifying realization that they are no longer feared, but merely pitied. For Anfernee Hardaway, the absolute rock bottom of his professional journey did not occur during a devastating loss on the court, but in the deeply humiliating silence of the inactive roster. The management regime of Isiah Thomas and Larry Brown made a coldly calculated, highly controversial decision to permanently exile the veteran to the furthest, darkest corner of the reserve bench. According to the official league statistical database for the 2005 to 2006 campaign, Hardaway was permitted to appear in a grand total of only 4 desperately brief matches. This incredibly low figure was not the result of a fresh physical injury. It was a deliberate, heavily publicized demotion by the coaching staff. How does a man who once legitimately challenged Michael Jordan for the throne of the entire league psychologically process being refused entry into a game even during meaningless garbage time? The tension eventually reached an absolute boiling point. In the widely circulated transcripts of his locker room interviews from that intensely frustrating winter, Penny publicly demanded fundamental respect, practically begging the front office to either play him or immediately orchestrate a trade. He felt entirely disrespected, publicly arguing that his extensive historical contributions to the sport earned him the basic right to be treated with absolute professional dignity. However, in the cutthroat, fiercely corporate business of the league, historical nostalgia holds absolutely zero financial value. The relentless New York media coldly portrayed his desperate pleas as the bitter complaints of an overpaid, washed-up relic refusing to accept his fading reality. The psychological torment of sitting helplessly in a tailored suit while the team drastically failed night after night pushed him to the absolute brink of total athletic despair. In February 2006, the New York executives finally eliminated his lucrative contract from their ledgers, shipping him directly back to his original basketball home in Florida. But this highly publicized return was nothing more than a deeply cynical financial manipulation designed to end his stardom forever. The grand illusion of a beautiful, heartwarming homecoming is one of the most highly profitable lies routinely sold to fiercely loyal sports fans. When the breaking news alerts flashed across television screens announcing that Anfernee Hardaway was being traded back to the Orlando Magic in exchange for Steve Francis, the entire state of Florida experienced a sudden collective wave of pure nostalgia. Fans instantly flooded the streets, desperately hoping to witness their original legendary prodigy finally finish his magical career exactly where it all miraculously started. However, the deeply cynical reality hiding inside the heavily guarded corporate boardroom was entirely devoid of any romantic sentiment. According to the official financial summaries submitted to the league office, the Orlando front office did not orchestrate this complex transaction to acquire a seasoned veteran leader. They simply wanted to strategically acquire his expiring contract. The absolute darkest side of the professional sports business was brutally exposed just a few short days later. In late February 2006, formal legal documents officially placing Anfernee on the unconditional waiver wire were quietly filed with the league headquarters. The franchise ruthlessly bought out his contract, completely releasing him from the active roster before he could even put on the iconic blue and black jersey one last time. Why would an enormous organization intentionally humiliate the exact same man who originally built their multi-million-dollar global brand? The answer, as always, was completely hidden in the cold, unfeeling accounting ledgers. The strategic maneuver successfully cleared a staggering amount of salary cap space, allowing the corporate executives to aggressively hunt for younger, significantly cheaper athletic assets. The deeply romanticized fairy tale was permanently destroyed by ruthless corporate accounting. Hardaway found himself entirely unemployed, violently pushed out of the league by the very same executives who once aggressively marketed him as the absolute future of the sport. Finding himself completely unwanted and entirely discarded by the brutal corporate machine, Penny retreated into the quiet shadows for nearly 2 long years, until the summer of 2007, when a highly unexpected phone call from a massive ghost of his past suddenly offered him one final, desperate dance on the hardwood. The unforgiving nature of professional sports rarely grants a beautiful, cinematic ending to its fallen kings. After nearly 2 agonizing years of complete, absolute silence away from the hardwood, a highly unexpected opportunity materialized from the heavy shadows of his glorious past. In the scorching summer heat of August 2007, Penny Hardaway formally signed a veteran minimum contract to join the highly competitive roster of the Miami Heat. According to the meticulously detailed league transaction logs from that specific month, this desperate, highly publicized reunion with Shaquille O'Neal was strictly a non-guaranteed financial agreement. The relentless sports media desperately attempted to heavily sell this emotional narrative to the public as the ultimate, triumphant return of the most electrifying duo of the 1990s. However, the deeply heartbreaking reality on the basketball court was entirely impossible to conceal. The 36-year-old veteran dragging his heavily surgically repaired knees up and down the floor was a mere phantom of the explosive superstar who once utterly dominated the entire league. In the closely monitored scouting reports filed by independent analysts during those grueling weeks, it was repeatedly noted that his once legendary blinding speed had completely evaporated, forcing him to rely entirely on his veteran basketball intellect to survive against younger, significantly faster opponents. How does a former absolute titan of the sport mentally process the devastating realization that his severely battered body can no longer physically execute the brilliant visions in his mind? The desperate experiment collapsed almost as quickly as it began. In the widely circulated official press release issued by the Miami franchise in December 2007, the management coldly announced that Hardaway had been officially waived, permanently severing his final tenuous connection to the active roster. His legendary jersey was quietly surrendered to the equipment manager, marking the absolute, unceremonious conclusion of a spectacularly tragic on-court journey. Yet, just as the sports world was busy writing his final, deeply tragic professional obituary, independent financial investigators actively combing through his heavily guarded corporate portfolios suddenly unearthed a staggering piece of documentary evidence that completely inverted the established narrative of his catastrophic downfall. The incredibly pervasive public narrative surrounding Anfernee Hardaway was aggressively framed by the media as a deeply tragic tale of immense unfulfilled potential and massive financial devastation. But a closer examination of his heavily guarded accounting ledgers reveals an entirely different, highly calculated reality. While the relentless sports press ruthlessly mocked his severely declining athletic output and heavily criticized his massive final contracts, Penny was quietly building an absolute corporate fortress behind heavily closed doors. According to the comprehensive wealth reports published by Forbes magazine detailing the highly lucrative retro sneaker market, his signature footwear line continued to generate tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue long after he played his final professional game. He had effectively transformed his legendary cultural cachet into a permanent, highly sustainable global brand. But exactly how did a man whose physical career was violently derailed by surgical disasters manage to construct such an impenetrable financial empire? In the meticulously verified financial databases maintained by prominent sports business portals, it was officially recorded that Hardaway amassed an astonishing sum of approximately $120 million purely from his playing contracts alone. Furthermore, investigative journalists actively analyzing his vast portfolio heavily noted that he completely avoided the typical devastating financial traps that ruin so many professional athletes, quietly funneling his massive earnings into highly lucrative real estate developments, luxury businesses, and strategic ownership stakes in regional sports clubs. He had brilliantly outsmarted the ruthless corporate machine that once coldly discarded him. The deeply tragic story of the shattered basketball prodigy was, in strict financial terms, an absolute masterpiece of wealth preservation and intelligent corporate branding. The massive fortune was heavily secured, and his family legacy was entirely safe, but a massive, agonizing void still remained deep inside his fiercely competitive soul, an undeniable urge for basketball redemption that drove him to sign a shocking, legally binding document in the spring of 2018 that brought him right back into the perilous spotlight. The absolute hardest addiction to permanently break is not the desperate pursuit of massive wealth, but the intoxicating, adrenaline-fueled roar of a packed basketball arena. For Anfernee Hardaway, the heavily air-conditioned comfort of a corporate boardroom could never truly replace the chaotic, intensely competitive environment of the hardwood. In a deeply shocking twist of fate, the man who was once universally branded by the media as a toxic, selfish coach killer decided to orchestrate his ultimate public redemption by stepping directly into the highly scrutinized role of a head collegiate coach himself. According to the official employment contracts formally ratified by the University of Memphis in the spring of 2018, Penny accepted the massive responsibility of leading the very same program that originally launched him into global superstardom. It was heavily marketed as a beautiful homecoming, a seasoned legend actively returning to desperately guide the next generation of highly vulnerable prodigies away from the dark traps of fame. However, the deeply cutthroat, highly unregulated world of amateur recruiting is a notoriously dangerous swamp, and Hardaway almost immediately found himself completely surrounded by intense institutional controversy. In the heavily redacted investigative files submitted by an independent regulatory committee of the collegiate sports governing body, serious allegations were formally raised regarding improper financial inducements and highly questionable recruiting tactics allegedly deployed by his coaching staff. How does a man who carefully spent decades meticulously rebuilding his shattered public image suddenly find himself sitting directly across from relentless federal investigators and highly skeptical compliance officers? The highly publicized scandal threatened to permanently tarnish his ultimate redemption arc, casting a massive, dark shadow over his heavily celebrated return to his hometown. Fortunately, he fiercely navigated the intense legal scrutiny, eventually clearing his heavily damaged name of the absolute most severe institutional charges. Yet, as we carefully review the massive, chaotic scope of his unbelievable journey from the dangerous streets to the corporate boardrooms and back to the incredibly stressful coaching sidelines, one massive, inescapable question remains entirely unanswered. The incredibly complex legacy of Anfernee Hardaway cannot be easily summarized by a simple glance at his final career statistics or the massive surgical scars permanently etched into his damaged knees. He represents the ultimate, highly agonizing scenario of stolen greatness in the entire history of modern professional sports. When we deeply analyze the official voting records for the elite league teams in the mid-1990s, it becomes absolutely undeniable that Penny was universally recognized as the sole, legitimate heir to the absolute highest throne in the basketball universe. He was not just a highly popular athlete. He was a massive cultural phenomenon who effortlessly blended breathtaking aerial artistry with cold, calculated competitive ruthlessness. According to the historical archives carefully preserved by the National Basketball Establishment, prominent Hall of Fame members routinely stated in their published memoirs that early Hardaway was the only singular talent capable of genuinely challenging the absolute greatest dynasty of that specific era. His devastatingly sudden, highly tragic collapse serves as a deeply terrifying reminder of the extreme fragility of the human body when subjected to the completely unforgiving, incredibly brutal demands of professional athletics. He did not fail because he lacked the necessary dedication or the psychological fortitude. His phenomenal physical vessel simply shattered under the immense, crushing weight of massive corporate expectations and incredibly reckless medical management. He was the most spectacular, blindingly bright shooting star of his entire generation, a magnificent force of nature that was forcefully extinguished long before it could reach its ultimate, predestined apex. We are left only with the mesmerizing, highly digitized highlight reels and the profoundly sad memories of a deeply stolen prime. As you look back at the shattered cartilage, the massive corporate betrayals, and the incredible millions generated by his undeniable brilliance, you have to ask yourself one deeply unsettling question. Did the ruthless machine of professional sports actually destroy his magnificent career? Or did Anfernee Hardaway simply sacrifice his own body to permanently immortalize his legendary name?